I'm particularly interested in Death on the Tracks, the series that you do that wins the Pulitzer Prize in 2005. If you could move us into your railroad story, because
Sure.
it was a magnificent piece of work again, and another epic. I mean, it was a joy to read, actually.
Well, selling a story about railroad crossings to a newspaper based in Manhattan is a tough sell.
Right.
It's what I do for a living, making tough sells to editors. I can say quite with a great deal of confidence that there aren't many railroad buffs in the editors' ranks around here. Yeah, I mean, they know model trains. This is a serious operation, and I think they probably thought I was slightly mad when I came in with this memo proposing this series on railroads. And to their credit, they didn't reject it out of hand. They said, well, if he wants to do it, let him do it. It's one of the great things about this place, is they let me go off and pursue the story. It was, to briefly describe it, a story about how railroad corporations were playing significant roles in covering up the facts of fatal accidents at railroad crossings. It wasn't a pleasant story to do. I had to spend so much time with the mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters of kids who were killed and shouldn't have been. It was dreadful. It's, I guess, the nature of investigative reporting to do stories like that. But and also, I had the great help from people like Tom Torok, our database person, and others.
Because one of the most powerful things about that series was the data, the fact that you showed how many people died from this problem. It wasn't a horrific anecdote of a single instance. You could see it was a national problem. And how did you did you get a tip about all this with one story and then widen it out? Or?
It began with a pharmaceutical company, Bayer, in a luncheon that we had here at the New York Times for Bayer executives. And we're sitting around, thick German accents, sitting around having a very awkward lunch. Happens frequently around here. Companies come in, not clear to anyone what their agenda was, but they paraded their executives, we paraded ours, we sat down, we broke bread. By the end of it, there's this awkward silence. It was like a bad date, and you gotta fill the silence a little bit. And that is a lesson for journalists that I try and teach too, that if you just don't say anything, interesting things happen. You fill the void, people feel compelled to talk, and so there's this silence at the end, and before everybody drops their fork on the plate and hustles on out of there, our business editor, Glenn Cramon, just to fill the void says, so what's your big issue in Washington this year? And without missing a beat, mumbles something like railroads. Everybody says goodbye, leaves, and I didn't think I had heard him correctly. And railroads, and I asked a couple other people who were in the meeting. They said, I didn't hear that. So I think I did. Finally, I found someone who said, yeah, they did say railroads. So I called them up. I said, what on earth do you care about railroads for? I mean, you're making all these drugs, and Bayer asked me, that's what you're not known for railroads. He said, well, listen, we're also in the chemical business, and we have to move a lot of product by railroads. And we're being taken advantage of them by them, and they're hugely powerful, and there's no one really looking over them in Washington. So my antenna went up, and in the course of just talking around the office and poking around, I came across some incident. Someone was killed at a railroad crossing in California, and was in the local paper. Someone had faxed it to me. And I called up the regulator, the Federal Railroad Administration. It took me a while to find out who regulates railroads in Washington, and I called them up, and I said, well, there's this accident at this crossing, and the police have concluded that the warning system didn't work, and that the gate went down and then popped up, and when it popped up, some old guy went through and was killed by a train. I said, what's the deal here? They said, where was the accident? And I told them. When was the accident? I told them. It's not in our computer. I said, what do you mean it's not in your computer? He said, well, they should have reported it. I go, I think I have a story here. and my instincts were right. And that was really the beginning. And these stories never start with one source, but it's akin to the old style of brewing coffee, where you recycle the water through the grounds over and over again till you get that rich brew. And I kept recycling it because I wasn't about to go to my editors and say, hey, there's some accident out in California. They're going to tell me to do something else. But when I had enough of that sort of thing, I went to them and they said, go for it.
In reading the stories, one of my favorite things, and frankly the creepiest thing, beyond the horror of what occurred, was the cover-up element of the railroad company people coming back and changing the scene so that no one would be able to see what really happened, and changing the account. I mean, how did you find out that they were doing that kind of stuff?
The big media, they don't cover railroad accidents. It's the tiny little towns, that's where this happens. And the lawyers in those tiny little towns that talk to the tiny little newspaper that has a tiny audience. And it's almost as though it's in a soundproof chamber down there, and the words never get out of there, spread across the country. And so there were all these accounts of lawyers and of victims talking about cover-ups. And viewed in isolation, well, it might be a local story. But if someone comes in and collects them and starts to get a fuller picture of a system that allows this to happen over and over again, that's a story for the New York Times. And it took a while, but it was with these small town lawyers who eventually led me to the individual cases.